Good evening, all, and welcome. Basements are naturally very creepy places to visit, which is why I suggest you stay on ground level. But if you must go, beware, for that is where the spooks like to reside, as I'm sure you'll find out. So for now, it's time to get comfortable. Lock your basement door, and let the darkness take control. This happened to me when I was in college, and is probably one of the creepiest and weirdest things to ever happen to me. I believe in ghosts. I've had countless experiences in my life that have made it almost impossible for me not to, and this still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was a freshman in college and was heavily involved in the arts, theatre and music specifically. The Fine Arts building of my college had quite a bit of history. It was built in 1916 and had previously been one of the largest Masonic temples in the city. This is fairly evident by the Masonic symbols adorning the building and covered the stained glass windows. I'd heard rumors of secret passageways under the building that ran all the way into downtown, but I will say I didn't believe them. A few of my professors had told stories of seeing shadow people or feeling like they were being watched when they knew they were alone, but I thought that they were just messing with us freshmen. I spent most of my time in the costume shop. I should note the costume shop was on the sub-ground floor, technically the basement. It was down 2 flights of stairs from the main entrance that led you to a landing with the costume shop and another door that I just assumed was a utility closet because it was always locked. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was just something off about it to me. On this particular evening, I had finished rehearsal for a play around 6 p.m. and figured I would do a bit of cleaning in the costume shop while I waited for my roommate to meet me so that we could grab some dinner. I was outside the costume shop when I heard a knock on the door. I walked over and looked out the small window to the right side of the door expecting to see my roommate, but there was no one. I opened the door and stepped out looking around. I looked down the hallway to the left of the door to see if my roommate was trying to freak me out. Nothing. I shrugged it off as me being tired and went back into the shop and shut the door behind me. I went about my business for a bit until I heard another knock on the door a few minutes later. I was more hesitant this time. I walked to the door and again I looked out the small window. Still there was no one outside. I tried to open the door, and while the handle turned, the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder thinking maybe the door was stuck, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like someone was holding the door shut. I looked out the window again and still didn't see anyone. I was now frantically pulling on the handle, feeling the fear rising in my chest. I let go of the handle only to have it start shaking wildly. Suddenly it stopped. Everything was quiet with the exception of my own shaky breath. Then from outside the door I heard the sound of a door creaking open. I gathered my strength and tried the door. It opened and I cautiously walked onto the landing. The always locked door was ajar. Hello? Is anyone there? I tried not to sound freaked out, but I was absolutely terrified. I pulled open the door, but was greeted by a pitch-black staircase leading down. It smelt like a tomb sealed for 100 years, musty and ancient. I felt the wall for a light switch but couldn't find one, and I reached into my pocket for my cell phone and turned the screen on. It was bright enough that I could sort of see my way as I made my way down the stairs. The walls were brick and the stairs were made of stone. The closer I got to the bottom, the colder it became, and I was on the second to last step, straining to see what was in front of me. It was a door, a large stone door. I was about to move to the last step when I heard it. Her voice was deep and sounded like it was right in front of me. I had only said one word. Welcome. I couldn't even scream. Instead, I ran up the stairs, tripping at some point and skinning my knee and shin. Once I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and ran out the building. My roommate showed up 5 minutes later to find me standing on the sidewalk shaking. After I told her what happened, she went inside to get my things and lock the costume shop door. When she came out, she looked at me with a worried expression. "The door was wide open when I went to get your stuff. Are you sure you closed it?" I just nodded my head. I walked home and didn't really talk more about it. I didn't go back into the building until the end of next week. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. When I finally did descend the stairs and felt a chill shoot through my body, I looked at the wall where the door had been, and there was nothing there. It was just a wall. I thought I was losing my mind. I walked to the wall and studied it. My drama teacher happened to be walking by and I stopped him. "Wasn't there a door here?" He chuckled. "Yeah, they walled it up last week. Did it in a hurry too. Not entirely sure why though. I always thought it was a closet or something." I can't say what I encountered that night. Was it the spirit of a Freemason who never left the temple? Was it something more sinister? I honestly don't know. I spent a lot of time in that building over the course of my 2 years at the college, and while I had other odd experiences, they were nothing compared to what I experienced that one awful night. I've been noticing some weird stuff happen in our basement recently. It seems to have taken off when our son was born. For context, both my husband's dad and my dad sadly passed away very suddenly at relatively young ages before our son was born. I've had experiences in our house before that makes me sometimes wonder if one or both of them come to visit on occasion. The first 2 stories I'd like to share with you are as follows. This first one happened a year ago. I was closing everything up to go to bed. I thought I heard a weird sound coming from the basement. It was my son's creepy toy cell phone, just blaring away by itself downstairs. The kind of toy where you physically need to press a button to get it to make a sound. Needless to say, no one was downstairs. When I went down to investigate, it was literally just lying face side up in the middle of the floor. So not like something had fallen on a button or anything. I instantly got the chills like crazy and noped back upstairs pretty quickly. Then about a week or so ago, I was downstairs changing the cat's litter box. Their litter box is in a utility room off the basement hall. To the right is our guest room, and to the left is our son's playroom. When I went downstairs, I noticed that my son's toy robot was sitting in the middle of the guest room. I distinctly remember thinking that it was a weird place for it to be, but shrugging it off, thinking that maybe my son had moved it last time we were down there together. I went and changed the litter, and when I came back out, the robot was sitting in the middle of the playroom again. It had jumped across the entire basement. No one else was downstairs with me, and while the robot can move by itself, it was definitely off, as it's super loud and obnoxious and there's no mistaking it. Then today, as it's Christmas, we got our son a wagon. My husband wrapped it up the other day and blew up a big red balloon that he tied to the wagon, as our son is obsessed with balloons. We left it downstairs in the basement for now, because it's huge and we wanted it to be a surprise. I was running out to the store quickly, and my husband and son were home alone. Suddenly from the basement, he hears a loud pop. He thought it was the cat, just up to no good, but she was upstairs in the kitchen with him. He went downstairs to check it out, and the balloon had popped by itself. It was in the middle of the room with nothing around it that was sharp, and not under any vent or anything. He just said the basement felt super off, and he got pretty creeped out. So, it seems like the creepy incidences are happening in the basement and more frequently. I'd also like to point out that my son has seen my late father-in-law. It happened both in the creepy basement as well as other places around the house. The other day we were eating lunch in the kitchen, and my son was pointing out the various pieces of his art that we've put up on the fridge. He points at one particular piece and says, "I made that one for Grandpa." If you recall, both his grandpas passed before he was born. I asked him which one he meant, and he said the grandpa who visits him at night. I lived in a very old home. I'm talking built in the 1700s and protected under the US Historical Register, kind of old. And the dude who built it was super rich. It's a big old white house, very The Conjuring-esque. I've lived there most of my childhood, along with my parents and 3 older siblings. I often played alone because my older brothers didn't want to play with their little sister, who's years younger than them. So naturally I spent a lot of time upstairs or in the library of the house. There were certain rooms that just had really good vibes, like nothing but happiness in there. There was also a small B&B type room upstairs, and my mum used it to store her extremely realistic portraits. You felt watched in there, but in contrast, there was the basement. Occasionally, I would visit my dad, down in the basement. He had a small workshop, and I hated the basement. Whenever I would walk down there, it's as if something was ever so slightly pushing me back up the stairs to safety. I felt like someone was always watching me down there, almost waiting for me to get just a little closer. Like I mentioned before, rooms in the house were either great vibes or hell no. One such room was the parlor. It just felt very cold, strict and harsh. Fast forward to years later. My mother is trying desperately to sell the house as we moved for my dad's job across the state. Everyone who's even rented it was out of the house a few months later. One day while she was showing the house, she brought me along as we're very close, and it's not unusual for me to go with her when she's showing houses. I was chilling in the kitchen when my phone died. I'd forgotten the charger. Anyway, I spot a binder on the table. Now this is my mum's thick binder of all the tenants who lived in the house since the 1700s, and I see a tab labelled deceased, and horror enthusiast me was morbidly curious. Apparently, a small girl had passed away in my room of pneumonia. I think, okay. However, a man had also ended his life via rope in the basement. Well, that explains the vibe, I think. Reading a little further, and there was an awful man who gambled away his life savings, avid racist, drank a lot, and remember how I said the library had great vibes? Apparently a really nice woman used that as her study to teach young girls. She also passed in that house. The parlor, very strict, old school woman, apparently had an aneurysm in that room. A year later, after countless rejects from prospective buyers, my mum decides to have the house cleansed. The woman comes and she was like a priest. She says that, and without knowing about any prior passings, mind you, that there was an evil in the basement actively trying to do us harm. However, she said it was countered by the good spirit of a woman, but she says it was a spirit of our family, someone we were close to. I asked her who it could be, but of course, she didn't know. To make an already long story short, she cleansed the house. Apparently, the evil within the basement was very old and very weak. She also said something quite interesting. She said that it was years since the house had a family, with children running about and bringing it to life in the place. The house loved us and didn't want us to let go of the family that it hadn't had in years. This was a few years back, so I can't really remember what comes after it, only that we eventually sold it. So yeah, That's my strange story about the paranormal. When I was young, I believe around 3 to 5, my mom moved into the city where I live with my dad, so I would usually only visit her on occasions. The house she moved into was a large 2-story 3-bedroom home with a 2-car garage and a nice backyard and a little treehouse for kids. The basement has always been a place my mum never wanted us to see. She never went down there, never even used it for storage. I never went down because she told me not to unless she was going down, which was almost never. I didn't think any more of it, and went along with my life. One summer I'd gone to stay with her for a while, and this was also around the time that everyone usually came over and visited anyway. So I had a few aunties, uncles, cousins, and my little brother. On this particular day, my brother and 2 cousins, who were my age or younger, went downstairs just to see what was there. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs, and I remember when it opened, a cool breeze came through and brushed my face. I turned on the light and walked inside. They were all pretty fantasized by how large and roomy it was. And the literal only thing that sat in that basement was a grand piano, which, later finding out, belonged to the previous owner and was there when my mum moved in. We wandered around for about 5 minutes. I was more drawn in by the piano because I'd always found it captivating as an instrument. Soon my mum found out we went down, but calmly called us up for dinner. We all ran up the stairs, me being the last one out, just making sure everyone was accounted for. We played for probably about only 1 minute before we realized that my brother wasn't with us. We looked for him, called his name, but there was no answer, and we couldn't find him. I went to the stairs and listened, and sure enough heard my brother frantically screaming and crying, wiggling at the door handle. I was confused because I thought he was up, and I didn't lock the door. I was scared, but I knew he must have been scared too, so I rushed down the stairs and quickly pushed the door open, and run back up, only to come face to face with my brother at the top of the stairs. "I'm right here," my brother says, walking out of his playroom. My bones shudder in fear. I look back down the stairs to see no one, and the door was creaked open. I think about it all the time, what it could have possibly been. I am 20 and no longer live at home, but we moved into my parents' house when I was 8 and my sister was 4. I had always had spirit encounters as long as I can remember and dreamed where people visited me. My sister now, 16, is going through the same thing. But when we were little, my parents made our basement into a playroom/office type area. The only problem is that neither me or my sister would go down there, to the point where my sister would scream and cry if she were forced to go. My mum's old dog passed in the old house, and in life hated thunderstorms, so a common occurrence at my old house was to hear her nails tapping along the hardwood floor, pacing during storms. Her residual spirit didn't follow us, but for a while I thought it did, because I would hear tapping. It took me about a year to realize it wasn't her, because it would happen even when it wasn't thundering, and moreover, it sounded different, almost like scratching. Around the time I was 10, my sister 6, I finally discovered that Elizabeth is a very stern, the world is one way type of woman. She did not like the basement, and she made it known by causing a cold spot on all our stairs leading down every time I or my sister tried to go down there. At this point, my sister would only go down there if my parents took her down. I would go only to pick things up for my mum or dad, but would get this feeling of being watched and hated every time I made it down there. Elizabeth was of course the ghost. When things started moving, at first it was toys that we had never touched down there. We were too scared to play with them. Then it was things that went missing. My dad's work files from the desktop, keys, and even once my cat's food bowl. See, the way our basement was laid out was that only the bottom half of it was sub-level, and the other half had a door into the garage, And it also had our laundry room, where my orange tabby cat had his food, water, bed, and litter box. But we used to have to carry my cat down there and force him to eat or use the litter box. But he'd be fine as long as the laundry room door was closed. One day me and my mom are watching a movie when I hear my cat freak out in the basement, then a slam. We both bolted to the basement to find my cat fluffed, hissing, and more importantly locked in the laundry room. None of us had even put him in. When I was 12, I was allowed to start having sleepovers. Well, girls consistently go home early, complaining that they didn't feel well. A few times later, they told me they were freaked out by our basement and couldn't sleep because they felt as if someone was watching them. This was around the same time I finally stopped seeing the Two-Hat Man. Almost every kid in my town is haunted by these same two spirits, apparently. And so I was really confused since I couldn't see him, and why was everyone else still complaining about it like he was still there? But when I was 14, something truly frightening happened. My friend and I were in the basement for a sleepover. It was around 3 a.m. and we were both woken up by what we thought was each other. But then we heard the scratching noises, and we couldn't be more confused. Then, honestly, I have no idea how to explain this next part without sounding even crazier than I already do. Something growled under the couch that we were both on, and not like a cat growl, something loud and vicious and evil. We both looked at each other confused and still scared. When I heard Elizabeth scream, "Go!" I grabbed my friend's hand and bolted up the stairs, explaining to my dad what happened. He let us sleep in my parents' room that night. Thanks, Ghost. The next day, my great-uncle came over. He's a priest, and blessed the entire house. He said he felt the evil thing in our basement leave. He said it was a demon. When my dad asked why it had been there so long without causing any harm, it was actually kind of funny. My parents had inherited a large, beautiful iron cross that my mum had decided to use as decor in the basement. That, on top of the fact that Elizabeth was there to protect me and my sister, meant it never really got the chance to get its hands on us. My great-uncle recommended putting salt in the corners of every room and saying the rosary as we did it. So once a month we did, and while I still have plenty of experiences in that house, none of them were ever evil again. Between the ages of 9 and 15, I lived in a very small northern town in a Canadian province. This town was the first European settlement in the province from way back in the late 1700s. The last remaining original building while I was living there was an old Hudson's Bay Company trading post. Most people living in the town were either full-blooded Cree or Métis, with a few white families throughout, one being mine, and there were a few First Nation reservations around the area. Basically, super old town in Canadian terms with lots of First Nation history. And here are my handful of experiences. The first house we lived in always had a heavy energy to it. That's what I remember most clearly about it. That, and my room was always cold, no matter how warm it was in the rest of the house. For a while, nothing seemed off, other than that. I do remember our dog, Shadow, a rescue mutt who looked like a black wolf dog, would always sleep in my room then. That was a bit out of the ordinary too. Since when we got her, she's always favored sleeping in my older sister's room, until we moved into that house. A few nights we would see her growling at nothing. This would of course be in my room, or at the top of the stairs. When I started going to school and attempting to make friends, the question would of course come up about where I lived. As I said, the town was small, very small. In the town and surrounding area, there may be max 500 people, and the junior/high school had a whopping 75 kids. So I mentioned the house and kids would be like, "Oh, that place is haunted." Someone had mentioned that their aunt used to live there and would keep a mirror at the top of the stairs of the basement to keep away the bad spirits. So yeah, that's what a 10-year-old likes to hear. Nothing horribly scary happened to me that I can recall, other than this one night. I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't notice it at first, but there was a very slow rhythmic tapping that sounded like it was coming from the wall. I checked the window to see if I had left it open, and the blinds were moving gently against it, but there was nothing. It was sealed tight. But the tapping continued. I checked my stereo. This was long enough ago that I still had one of those extendable metal antennae to see if it was vibrating for some reason, and it was hitting the wall. But it wasn't, and the tapping persisted. Now completely perplexed, I decided to get up and have a better look around my room, and as soon as I sat up, the tapping increased in speed and aggression. Startled, I laid back down, and it slowed down again. I tried once more and the same thing happened, with it tapping more furiously and intensely. So I laid back down and did what every kid does. I threw the blankets over my head and somehow I managed to fall back asleep. When I woke up again, it was 7 a.m. and the sun was up, and my room was quiet. That was the only night I remember Shadow not staying in my room at night. Eventually we moved to a better house in a different area. The air was lighter and the rooms brighter, but there was still something off. I began to see shadows out of the corner of my eyes, on the periphery of my vision. Dark heads poking around corners or peeking through the banisters on the stairs. I know now about shadow people and I didn't then. I can say though that it was never outright aggressive, just enough of a feeling of otherness that it unsettled me and my friend. Every once in a while I would hear my dad come home from work. The garage door would open, I'd hear my dad close the truck, and there was a heavy metal door from the garage in the house. I would hear that open, close, and then my dad put his briefcase on his desk. I'd turn around from my cartoons to greet him, but he wasn't there. Then almost always an hour later I'd hear it again, and this time it actually was my dad. It wasn't until one day when my mum, my sister and I were having a conversation over lunch that one of us mentions seeing shadows in the house, and from there, the stories we've all kept to ourselves start coming out. My sister, whose room was right next to my dad's office at the entrance, told us she also heard the imitation of our dad come home. She also mentioned that one time she went to the washroom and it was occupied. She waited outside the door, heard the toilet flush, heard the sink turn on and off, the fan and the light turn off, the door unlock and open, but no one walked out. Another time she was in a room speaking with her boyfriend, telling him about George, because that's what we decided to name the shadow person. He laughed it off, and like any silly boy with something to prove, started mocking him. He said a wind blew through the office outside her room and blew papers everywhere towards the guy. She also had weird experiences in our first house. Being the edgy teen that she was, she insisted on having a room in the basement. She said that she would see red eyes at night sometimes and hear her name called. Another time, she went to her friend's place. The friend's place happens to be the old original Hudson's Bay Company building. And being the genius spooky kids they were, they thought they'd play with a Ouija board. This ended up with another massive gust of wind, her friend speaking in tongues, and footsteps on the fire escape. The third account that people often report is the devil's footprints. Bipedal cloven footprints left in the snow. Enough people up there are avid hunters and trackers that I trust them to know the difference between a natural animal print and something else. There's also an old hospital. Some nights a mist would form in the outline of it, but the hospital is now gone, and the mist swirls around its vanished foundations. Many of the First Nation kids I went to school with would talk about seeing a Wendigo in the woods. At the time I had no idea what a Wendigo was, just that the kids were very freaked out by it. That's what I remember from about 20 years ago in rural northern Canada. I was living with my mother's ex-husband because he was my father figure when I was younger. I didn't know I was home alone until after everything, and we were in an old house. I was upstairs in my bed just resting and wanting to take a nap, but it was one of those days where you want to sleep, but you have so much energy at the same time you're just thinking. I was laying there and I heard the basement door open. Someone walking down the hallway again. Even though it's an old house, I could hear every movement, and I was in silence with my bedroom door open. They walked down the hall and to the stairs that led to all the bedrooms, and I thought it was my stepdad at the time just going to his room to get ready. I heard every step. It was slow, pronounced, and steady. Then I heard the shuffling of feet on the carpet, and I was still facing the wall, and the feet walked into my room and went right behind me. For some reason I didn't feel like talking, so I pretended I was asleep because I thought it was my stepdad. So I closed my eyes and pretended not to be conscious. After 30 seconds, I heard the feet turn around and walk back down the stairs, down the hall, and close the basement door. Immediately after that, the garage door opened and I heard my stepdad, his girlfriend, and her kids walk into the house. I was home alone the entire time. When I was 16 back in 2006, my best friend and I used to go to her brother's house to use his wife's tanning bed. One day me and my best friend were alone in the house. She had a copy of the key, and she said I could tan first while she checked her Yahoo Messenger. So I went to the basement where the tanning bed was. It was in a room all by itself. It was actually a hidden room. The door was in a closet, so if the clothes were in front, you wouldn't know it was there. I got all lotioned up and had the tanning bed heating up. After it went off from the initial warm-up, I put in my headphones and just played a random song from my iPod. This was a 20-minute tanning bed, but after 5 minutes it shuts itself off. I get out, restart it, and get back in, and after a few minutes I can hear footsteps over my music. I turn my head sideways and look through the crack of the tanning bed, and notice nothing. Even though I said my friend's name, I got no response. So I just closed my eyes until the bed shut itself off again. I got out and was getting dressed when I noticed my glasses on the floor. They were twisted and out of shape, like one side was in the normal position and the other was now facing the ceiling. Immediately I ran up the stairs. My best friend hadn't left the computer. She was always on Yahoo Chat, and I told her what happened and we both were freaking out. She decided not to tan that day. Bad thing is, this wasn't the first time something had happened in the basement. We used to spend the night there all the time, but stuff would just randomly happen, and so we started to avoid it. The basement where my uni assigned the clubs to set base. I clearly remember that this was on my first day of going to college. A friend from high school wanted to audition for the choir, and he was a little embarrassed, so he dragged me along. Turned out, non-auditionees weren't allowed to enter the club room, so I waited outside looking like a dork. The room next to the choir belonged to the dance club. There was an upperclassman blasting music while he sat by the door like he was some bouncer. I took the liberty of glancing inside the cramped room. They didn't have much, some chairs, student things, and a clothes hanger, and a shabby-looking closet. Like, they just hanged a pole between two walls and started hanging their costumes there, nothing really eye-catching except for a small pale hand that suddenly protruded from between the clothes. Jesus, did it make my eyes bulge and my heart pound so fast. I looked at the upperclassman and he looked at me, probably noticing how startled I looked, and he shook his head and told me, "Don't mind it," and blasted his music louder. The hand also slipped back into the closet. Like I said, it's just a pole they had hanging clothes on. It wasn't really a closet, so there's no way I would have missed it. And the fact that there were no feet standing below or a person behind those clothes, just a pale child's hand. I yeeted out of that place and left the doofus who was still doing auditions behind. I started hearing these noises, like the noises you know are happening, but you can't really explain what sounds they were. The best way to put it is that it was shuffling. But this isn't the first time that it's happened on Friday night. My dad has heard banging on our washer and dryer, and he assumed that someone had broken in, so we asked him if he locked the back door. And when he got back from work, he said, probably not. So he grabbed a firearm and I a bat, and we went with him, and found out the door was locked. So we were going back upstairs, and he said, well, what if they locked it when we came down to make it seem like they weren't here? So we went into the basement and turned on every light, checked every corner until we got to the washer and dryer. Here's a little context about the washer and dryer room that we keep shut because it leaks when we do laundry. But the room is fairly big and only half of it gets wet, but the other half is nice looking with a tile floor. When we first moved in, we found that they'd left Beatle posters in there, so I put it in my room, but that soon changed when I had to put it back downstairs. When we finally moved in, I didn't actually sleep there. I actually spent the night at a family member's house and stayed for 2 days. But when I came home, I didn't actually sleep. I stayed up all night playing a game with some pals. It's also important to note that my door is busted, so when you push the door open, it gets stuck at the top, so you have to push it open with force. I believe it was around sunrise when I heard this noise, the sound of scratching, but the off part wasn't at the bottom. It was closer to the top of the door, so I kind of stared at the door while it was happening, and then the door would push forward a bit like someone wanted to come in, but eventually stopped outside, and it wasn't my cat, because he was sleeping in my parents' room with the door closed, and after that, our guests would say they had an uneasy feeling in the basement, and soon, people would start seeing things walking through doorways in the basement. So we did the sage thing and it stopped, but we would start hearing talking. So I finally put the poster downstairs again and it stopped for a few months. Side note, we later figured out that the owner's brother was shot and lost his life here during a party, and the person who did it to them ended their own life on our porch. And there's blood stains on the stairs and on the carpet and in the front room. And until we started moving around the basement to fit my drum set, and after we soon found an old book from the previous owner, from then till now we kept hearing the drums be played while no one's downstairs. One day I had a friend over. We were hanging out in the room with the posters, and we have this cubby hole that once you go in, it's the width of the wall. So me and my pal went to the end and sat there in the dark and tried to ask questions, but nothing happened until we saw a face at the end, close to the entrance, so we got scared and left. My friend didn't like going down there after this last incident, so me and my buddy were messing around, and I think he was trash talking the thing, so it would do something, and all I remember is my friend falling and hitting his head on a baseball bat on the floor, and he later said that I pushed him, and he had hit his head, and he couldn't see my face, it was so dark, and I was trying to pick him up, and he said he thinks something weird was going on. And he had this weird dream a few days ago of something attacking him, where it was all dark and it tried to pick him up. After that, my cabinets would open by themselves during the night, and so we just asked for it to stop and leave us alone, and it did. But then the drums started happening and my grandma passed away, and my mum and I would start waking up with bruises for about a week, and soon we started hearing conversations in the basement. It's like you could hear the sound of talking, but you couldn't make out anything they said. And then it started moving stuff when I got to school. I'd closed my door, and one day my mum was in the kitchen making food when she heard things being thrown and tossed around in my room, but she was too scared to find out what was happening. So when I came home, most of my pop vinyl figures were on the floor everywhere, and sometimes we would hear the broken dryer downstairs move slightly, and soon it moved to talking in our kitchen, and then it just stopped. Until last month. Lately, all it's been doing is making noise when we watch TV, but when we pause it or mute it to listen, to see what's happening, it will stop, and that's what confuses us the most. I've seen our doorbell ring. The most noticeable of all is this mist that already looks like a dog, but when you look outside, it's nothing. And that brings us to today. If maybe someone could help me explain it, I'd be gratefully appreciative. Hey guys, it's Maud here and thank you so much for listening. Do love me a few good basement stories, don't you? Basements are creepy places to say the least. Not somewhere I find myself in very often, seeing as I do not have one. I don't think I've ever lived in a house with a basement. I only recall one family friend who actually ever had one, and I don't even think I went down. In any case, if you have a story of something scary or horrific you would like to share, you know you can send it to my email address or Reddit, as I would love to read it. Just be sure to put in proper punctuation, grammar, and detail to make it easier to read. As always, I'd like to extend a huge thanks to my... Good evening all, and welcome. A closet is a strange space where you store many of your worldly possessions, but not a place you're in very often. However, it doesn't mean that others can't get comfortable inside it. Creepers may enter your home and hide within them, or perhaps something of a more paranormal nature. It's time for you to find out. So get comfortable, lock those closets, and let the darkness take control. When I was almost 12, the woman living above me was a coke dealer. The night of my 12th birthday, she went missing. Not long after, her boyfriend came down to ask if he could use our phone. This was 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception to the rule, at least in my area. For a little context, I was home alone a lot of the time, while my mum was at work about a 5-minute walk away. My mum had let our neighbour and her boyfriend come in to use our phone several other times before, so I assumed nothing was wrong with it, and let him in, bringing him into the living room, which is towards the front of our apartment, to use the phone in there. He picks up the receiver, dials a number, waits a few seconds, then hangs up the phone. He does this a few more times before the front door of the building opens. You can easily hear the front door open from where we are, as it's a heavy door and the walls are very thin. It's just the way our apartment is set up. Me and my mum's apartment was the only one on the first floor, and our upstairs neighbour's apartment was the only one above us. My neighbour's boyfriend looked at me, put his finger to his lips like he was trying to shush me, and told me not to tell anyone he was there before speed walking to my room at the other end of the apartment. I watched my bedroom door close right before there was a loud, hard, cop-like knock on the door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a cop. He asked if my neighbour's boyfriend was there, and being scared, I stammered out, "Yeah, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, to which I agreed, and as he was coming in, he asked if I could get his partner in the back door and lead them to my room. We walked together to the back of the apartment and I let in his partner. The back door to the apartment was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to walk around the kitchen table to get there. There was just barely enough space between the two doors to fit a narrow rectangular table against it without blocking the path to either door. After I let them into my room, I watched as they pulled my neighbour's boyfriend out of my bedroom closet, as they brought him out of my room and towards the back door, which led to an enclosed fire escape. They told me to go wait in the living room while they brought him out the back door. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could hear the distinct sound of metal clinking and quickly realized that he had just been handcuffed. Still scared, I waited for the police car to drive away before grabbing my keys, making sure the back door was locked, and locking the front door on my way out before running to my mum's work crying. I'm pretty sure I cut the 5-minute trip to about 2, and I've never been a faster runner. I was fueled entirely on adrenaline and fear at that point. I just wanted my mum. When I told her what happened, my mum was pissed that he had used me the way he had, hiding out in a child's bedroom closet, of all the places to try and keep the cops from finding him. She gave me a short but gentle lecture that night about not letting people in to use the phone, telling me that I was not to let people use our phone even if I knew them unless she was home. I didn't know what exactly he wanted from us, nor do I know what would have happened if the cops hadn't have shown up. I don't know if he had known that the cops were on their way and he had come to my apartment specifically to hide from them, or if he was up to something else and knew it was the cops when the front door building opened. Our upstairs neighbor's boyfriend, let's never meet again. This happened when I was a toddler, and don't remember it myself, but my family has told me through the years, and something that happened to me a few nights ago made me think about it, and my mum filled me in on the details. My mum is a sensitive and can walk into a house and feel spirits, and sometimes tells you if they're evil or just lost. In my family, we have a good amount of non-believers, but also plenty of family members who do believe. So growing up, I've always just felt comfortable with all that. I've lived in haunted houses, spirits have visited me, and the specific story happened when I was 4 or 5. My parents were going through some marriage troubles. My father was getting abusive and lashing out, and obviously my mum was struggling with that. After 3 months of attitude and personality changes, things started happening to me. I would get bruises on my body, scratches on my back, some of them so bad they started bleeding, and I was changing. I'd have trouble sleeping, hated being alone, and I hated my room, and I kept telling people that the man was hurting me. Obviously, this led people to believe it was my father doing it. He had been hitting my mother, yelled at me and locked me in a closet. So, my mum kicked him out, leaving him to go stay with his own father while she tried to figure out what to do. This helped, or so it seemed. I started getting back to normal. I was happy and bubbly, but the bruises and scratches faded. And we were happy for about a month. During a normal bath time, my mother and I were playing with one of my dolls when she noticed something. There was a long scratch down my back. At first, she wrote it off as kids playing around and scratching themselves. That had to be it, but they kept appearing. The bruises were coming back, and then I started talking about the man again. My mum said the way I described him was chilling, and she instantly believed me and contacted her uncle, who was a priest for prisons. The story I told my mum was that at night, after she put me to bed, someone would come out of my closet. Not just walk way out, a mist would come from under the closet door and a man would appear from that mist. This man wore what looked to be jeans and a white tank top, which my mum figures was a wife-beater of some sort, and would sit on my bed and talk to me. At first, he was nice and play with my hair. He would tell me stories. His name was Bill. He used to be a cop, and he had lost his wife and family because he was bad to them. And then he started to change. He wanted me to go to the closet with him, and that scared me for whatever reason. Even that young, I knew something was wrong. Looking back at the time, my mum believes that it was when I started to be scared of my room and when I wanted to refuse to sleep in there. After I refused the man, he got worse and mean and started hurting me, which is when the bruises and scratches began to appear. He would try pulling me from the bed to the closet. He would throw things at me. But what got my mum is when I started describing what the man said he would do to me and my family if I didn't come with him. Understandably, my mum was very upset, and she called her Uncle Tucker, knowing what it had to be. Though she wasn't sure why she'd never felt him, and she felt she had failed me in some way. When Tucker arrived, he talked to me, wanting to know the story, which I shared with him. It piqued his interest because it was a chance that it was simply my imagination. They both felt that my story might have been swayed some, at least a few details. Once he was talking to me, he headed to my room, Bible and holy water in hand. They have both told me that when he walked into the room, instantly something dark washed over him and it worried him. So he started praying, talking to it, and finally blessed the room. and Tucker said he could guarantee that it was a demon, and it wanted my soul and possibly to take over my body. From what he could put together, from what was shown and told in the room along with my story, he believes that Bill was a cop, or at least would use that to make his victims more comfortable around him, which wasn't uncommon, and he was sure Bill had harmed his family, and that's why they left him. Tucker thought that the ghost slash spirit slash demon, whatever you want to call it, was hooked onto me not only because I was a child, which makes the connection easy, but because I was most likely sensitive like my mother, which Tucker had strongly believed since they found out she was pregnant. I won't go into details behind that because there's a lot of information. Back to the point. He warned her that it was probably going to keep happening and that I would deal with it my entire life. That I just needed to be strong and not to trust in every spirit I see. Luckily, after he blessed the house and prayed over me, Bill left, and I never dealt with him again. Thankfully, I was young enough that I don't have a memory of it. I've seen pictures of the scratches and bruises, but don't remember it, and while Bill might have left me, I've dealt with spirits my entire life, and I know I always will. This didn't happen to me, but has been relayed to me from my late grandfather, who was one of the most honest men I have ever met. He was the kind of guy whose word meant law. When he said something, that was it. It wasn't ever a lie. In any case, here is his story. My grandfather was born in 1931 in a poor and rural part of the US. From a young age, he helped his parents on the farm, as I'm sure many other kids at that era were forced to do. Towards the end of the farm, the land sort of went down a small hill, at which point it wasn't very harvested by my family. And bordering the bottom of the hill was a deep and dark forest. There'd be times my grandpa would tell me when he was about 10 or 11, when he'd get to the edge at the top of the hill and look down towards the forest. There'd be times where he would see a dark shape, a shadow, staring at him with glowing green eyes. He always thought it was his imagination, and after telling his mum one day, she told him that it was one of the forest sprites and to ignore it, and if he ignored it, it would leave him alone. He took her advice and tried to ignore it. He didn't see it frequently, but when he did, he really tried to pretend it didn't exist because it frightened him deeply. Something so wrong. He said its aura, its presence, felt dark. That's the best way he could describe it. A continued oppressive feeling that bore down on him. Weeks at a time went by, and he wouldn't see the figure frequently. About 2 years later, once again, finishing up at the end of the field, did he dare to glance down, admiring the sunset, when he saw the twinkle of green eyes and a dark, shadowy blob move behind the trees. He didn't even bother looking. He just bolted home. And that same night, as he was going to bed and turning out the light, did he look out and see something in the distance? The glowing eyes. They were no longer in the forest, which wasn't visible from his house. Instead, it was by some nearby trees in the distance. He got spooked. He jumped straight into bed without drawing the curtains and pulled the covers up to his eyes. There he lay, looking intently at the darkness under his sheets. He tried falling asleep, but the fear was all-consuming. When it got to a point, he told himself he must be imagining it. Did he pull down the covers ever so slightly, just to get that sweet reassurance that there was nothing in there with him? He pulled the covers back, and there was nothing in the room. He chanced to look at the window. He was going to make a run for it and close the curtains quickly, but just as he was about to close them, did he notice that the pair of green eyes were now dangerously close to the window. As they closed, he ran back into bed in absolute darkness and fell asleep, shaking. At some point in the night, he awoke needing to use the bathroom. He remembers slipping off his bed, taking a few steps, and hearing a creak. This wasn't the distinct creak of the floor. This was the creak of his closet door. He thought it was strange, but assumed it was either a cat or a dog, as they had several that lived on the farm, and he walked to the toilet. Upon returning from doing his business and getting back to bed, did he hear the creak once more? He was tired, but still afraid from the events of earlier. He was still trying to convince himself that it never happened and was all in his imagination. And with the tinge of bravery still lingering inside him, did he sit up properly and squint towards the dark corner of the room where the sound had came from. It was the closet. He thought maybe he'd best check to make sure nothing strange was going on. So he got out of bed again, pulled the door to the closet back, which was slightly ajar, and in the bottom, near his shoes, were those green eyes. He said he can't remember anything that happened after that, other than the dark mass, this blob with the green eyes rising higher than his clothes, and suddenly he passed out. He woke up in the morning at the foot of his closet on his wooden floor, in pain a little bit, his mother asking if he was all right. He had no recollection of the night before until later that day, when it all came back to him. He never saw the green-eyed thing again, but it scared the living daylights out of him, and for a long time he refused to go anywhere near that forest. His sisters all enjoyed going down to that forest to play with their friends, but he would always stay clear of it. The house and property were eventually sold off when he was a young adult, and he's never been back, and has refused to tell me where it was located, in case the creature, whatever it may be, still remains. I had a strange feeling today that left me paranoid, even now as I'm working my typical graveyard shift. Well, it wasn't just a feeling. I wish it was. But unfortunately, it is not the case. I'm home alone, working on a painting when I hear my floorboards creak. Now, my floors are very creaky, and I'm average height and weight, with a fair share of ass-kicking instances. So initially, I was not alarmed. I lived with two other people, Andy and Teddy. Both had gone out earlier. I didn't remember hearing Teddy's car pull in. It's a big-ass white truck, and it's very hard to miss due to the gravel in the driveway. Even if I had missed it, Andy typically likes to come in yelling or singing obnoxiously, so obviously I was like, what the hell? I wait for a while and hear nothing, so continue painting. Then I get this incredibly horrid feeling of dread, so much so that every muscle in my body tenses, and then the creaking happens again. And me being a classic dummy, put my paintbrush down, open the door to my room, and walk out to see nothing. So I venture out into the kitchen, and the feeling grows stronger, to the point where I feel the need to protect myself. So I dash over to pick up a small knife I remembered Andy had left on the kitchen table earlier. I walk further down the hall, first into the bathroom, where again I see nothing, and then into Andy's room. This is where the feeling grows even worse. I grip the knife as hard as I can behind my pack and peek into the closet. His closet is the type with the double doors that slide open. One of the doors is already pushed open and I can feel something crouching in the darkness behind the closed side. I can feel something watching me. I continue to stare, my breath caught in my throat. Then something changes, and it feels as if whatever is in there is now making direct eye contact. It stares at me so much that I stumble back out the room. I quickly check Teddy's room, see nothing, and just as quickly note the hell back to my room. Shaking, I shut the door and put whatever songs I was listening to its highest volume, and the feeling just disappears. As if a hood was pulled over my head, everything just feels incredibly normal. Whether I'm going crazy or not is debatable. I wouldn't doubt it though. Definitely some weird stuff that I don't appreciate. I live with my parents in a really small village in Europe. Our house is quite big and directly attached to my grandparents' house, which is basically a big house cut into two. And the house next to theirs are my aunt and uncle's house. So yeah, we all live really close together and often pay each other random visits. On top of that, my grandparents' front door is always open during the day, so me and my cousins can come in whenever we want. Since it's a small village, we know basically everyone, and we're not too scared to leave the door open. People always have to walk across the whole garden to reach the front door, so it's quite safe and hidden. So now one day I was home alone because my parents were working and I didn't have any classes. My grandpa, uncle, auntie and cousin were also working, so it was just us two. My grandma was chilling in her kitchen, which is a little square room in the corner of the living room, which is a bigger square room. So when you walk from the kitchen to the entrance of the house, there's a part of the living room that you don't see. Suddenly my grandma heard the front door open and close. My family and I usually yell greetings when we enter so we know they're here. But she heard the door and nothing else, so of course she stands up and calls out for my dad, and then my uncle. But nobody answered. She starts walking to the entrance to see if maybe she left the door wide open or something. But as she walked away from the kitchen, she hears a creak behind her. Now remember the part of the living room I talked about? The one you can't see when you're walking away from the kitchen? Yeah. Well, there you find a huge Narnia-style wardrobe. When my grandma turns around, she sees the wardrobe door wobbling a bit, like if it wasn't completely closed. She gets closer to realize someone's hiding in it. She starts yelling at the stranger, asking him to get out. He does and stands awkwardly for a few seconds. My grandma is this small little lady, and the guy was way taller than her. She didn't really know what to do at this point. She asked him what he was doing here, and after hesitating a bit, he said he thought this was a restaurant and got confused. Lol. My grandma told me that he kept looking around the room, and it looked like he was trying to find a weapon. For some reason, my grandma walked towards him while asking him to leave, probably trying to intimidate him, and he began running to the front door, pushing my grandma since she was in his way, but thankfully she didn't get too hurt while falling. She then closed the door, called me to tell me to do the same, and waited for my dad and grandpa to come home. When they did, they called the cops and made sure that no one else had been hiding in the house. The cops told us a few cases like this had been reported in the village around us. For most of them, the guy just came in, since a lot of the people in this village left their doors open and stole stuff. But apparently, an old lady in a similar situation lost her life from probably the same guy. So the cops told us that my grandma calling for two men when she heard the door open probably saved her life, because the guy thought there was someone else in the house. When my husband's father passed away back in 2012, we inherited so many antiques and family heirlooms from him. One of which is this giant old wooden wardrobe, about 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide, which was made by my husband's great-great-grandfather. Since it was so huge, we didn't really have room for it in our house and kept it in our garage. We call it the Narnia closet. Before my son was born, I used to go into the garage to smoke weed every night. I'd be sitting out there, and without fail, at some point, I'd get that strange feeling of the hair rising on the back of my neck. I'd look over at the Narnia closet, and the door would slowly start to swing open. It creeped me out so badly that I always would go to close it, then run back inside. It literally would happen every time I'd go there by myself. We have a pool table that kind of is a man cave set up in a garage, so our friends would frequently be hanging out with us, smoking and drinking. Not once did the wardrobe door open when I was with other people. I later asked my husband and my sister-in-law if they had ever witnessed the door coming open by itself, and they looked at me like I was crazy and said they had never seen that happen before. I checked the latch so many times and it was actually really sturdy, not like it could just pop open at any given time. One afternoon I was out smoking and like clockwork the door slowly creaked open. At this point I had enough and was scared. I lost it a bit and screamed something like, "You need to stop opening the Narnia door. You're freaking me out. Please never do it again." And guess what? Since I said that about 4 years ago, I have never seen the wardrobe open by itself again. A few years ago, my family moved into the house that we currently live in now. The first night I stayed in my room, I was having a difficult time going to sleep, as I couldn't shake this weird feeling that had come over me. I'd been trying to sleep with my back to the closet, and decided to get up and get water. But when I turned around, I became very aware of a face staring straight at me from the inside of my closet. The face looked as if it was a mask made of glossy white porcelain, where the eyes and mouth should have been, but there was nothing but empty holes. Somehow, it was darker than the entire room, even without any eyes. I could tell this thing was looking right at me, and filled me with a fear and unease, unlike anything I've ever felt in my life until now. I jumped out of bed and managed to turn the lights on, but as I tried to run out of the room in the hallway, I found that I couldn't leave, and even though I could move freely in the room and the door was open, it was as though something was blocking the exit. As a last resort, I tried to call for my parents and my brother who were asleep downstairs, but couldn't muster any sound. It seemed as if the wind had been knocked out of me whenever I tried. I ended up hiding underneath the covers of my bed to get through the night, and for the next few days I still felt as though something was there in my room, until the feeling went away suddenly. I discovered a few weeks later that my grandmother had secretly prayed over the room after hearing that I had told my mother the day after this experience. Surprisingly, I think this may have had an effect on whatever was there. I've not seen the figure in my room since then, nor have I had another experience like that, though I have caught glimpses of it in the room across the hall, and even once while in a corn maze in October a few years back. I was wondering if anyone has ever experienced anything akin to this. This happened to me when I was 5 or 6 years old in my old house. At the time, the house only had 2 rooms, so me and my brother shared a room while my mum and stepdad slept in the other. My brother was at a sleepover this night, and my best friend Kylie slept over. She slept on my brother's top bunk. At around 3 a.m. I woke up. Kylie was still asleep, and I was facing towards my wall. I turned over to my other side and looked at my closet door, and I clearly remember how scared I was when I stared straight at a tall shadow-like man on my closet. Of course, the first thing I thought of was Slender Man, and I still kind of believe it looked a bit like him. I got up nervously and looked out my window, which was directly across from my closet, to see if there was something outside casting a shadow. Lo and behold, nothing. I ran back to my bed, hid under my covers, and fell asleep. The next morning I told my friend all about it and she believed me. Of course, I saw this again last year. Me and Kylie had a sleepover at her house, and we were pulling an all-nighter. At about midnight, her parents were asleep, and we snuck downstairs, grabbed a box of Cheez-Its and Triscuits, and I went out of the living room to grab a bag of Smart Food that we left in the living room before we went up at 10. When I grabbed the crisps, I saw something from the corner of my eye. Of course, it was the same thing that I had seen years ago. I dragged Kylie out of the kitchen and showed her. At that point, we just went upstairs and binge-watched Big Mouth. Picture this. You're in my bed. To the right of my bed on the wall is my closet. It doesn't have doors, just a curtain that I use to block it off. Except the curtain will move sometimes and reveal the inside of it. It's never bothered me until one night. I had a friend over and they fell asleep. I stayed up because I wasn't very tired. After an hour of being on my phone, I switched it off and turned to face my closet, which is when two circular red dots glared at me from the crack in the closet. I froze and tried to use one of my arms to slowly reach behind me and tap my friend awake. I guess whatever was in my closet noticed what I was doing, and I started to hear heavy breathing coming from there. I noticed the side of the curtain was moving in and out from the breathing. I started flipping out even more and turned around quickly to shake my friend awake. Right as my friend opened her eyes, she said, "Don't look at it," then sat up and screamed. I don't know what to do, but I looked back at my closet, and it was gone. I felt hot and dizzy. Then my friend asked if I was okay and why I awoke her. I turned back to face her, and that was that. Me and my friend were doing night shifts for a production at school, setting up the stage, etc. for the production later in the month. There were two janitors helping us with the setup, one of which went home for the night, both of which have a key to a closet. One of the usual school closets surrounded by rumors, said to have the bodies of children inside it. However, it just has the security monitors and broomsticks. The security cameras are always turned off and are just for show. I needed the bathroom, so being a wuss, me and my friend went to the restrooms, heading past the closet door as we went in. It was a little bit open, something that's a bit out of the ordinary, but we ignored it and thought nothing of it. I greeted my friend as I came out of the stall and noticed another unordinary thing. The security camera outside the toilet was on. Being veterans of the school, I knew it was something to do with the open closet. Maybe the janitor turned the cameras back on. It was night shift after all, but it wasn't like them though. So we headed back to the hall to finish for the night again, passing the closet door as we went. We asked the janitor if he knew anything about the open door. He knew nothing about it. He said he would ask the other janitors in the morning. We finished for the night, leaving him to lock the closet and the gates we left from. The next day was pouring with rain. This time both janitors were there, agreeing that neither of us had used the closet in well over a week. My friend and I, being suspicious, did the same thing as we did the previous day and checked the door as we went down the hall towards the restroom. But this time it was wide open. A wet umbrella hung dismally from the center chair, surrounded by 3 monitors, all turned on, controlling the security cameras. I sent my friend to tell the janitors and stayed behind, looking at the room a bit more. The window to the left of the chair was open. It was small, but just large enough to fit someone of a small stature through it. After a while, the janitors came and saw the umbrella and called the police after realizing that no one but them could enter the room, and the umbrella didn't belong to any of them. A week passed and I was freaked out by the incident and barely slept at all. The police investigation told the school that someone did in fact use the window to get into the closet room, and most likely use their monitors to check who was in the building. But they never managed to find the closet man, nor his motives for why he was in the school. I grew up in a house that was home to a malevolent entity. If not malevolent in nature, I do firmly believe that this entity fed off negative emotions and energy. My family being largely dysfunctional and abusive, the entity was well nourished. It was free to roam the house. There's pretty much no part of the house I didn't see it in at some point, although it was mostly seen around the staircase. Hence the nickname Stairwell Demon my sister and I used on the ground floor. The Stairwell Demon presented itself as a large, gangly shadow figure. Think Slender Man, but just darkness and only one set of arms. A very vivid memory of mine is the Stairwell Demon coming into my room at night, sitting on the floor while staring at me and getting into my wardrobe. Since then, I have been absolutely petrified of wardrobes. Now, I have left my family and that house behind. While I did have paranormal experiences in my first apartment, I've never seen the Stairwell Demon anywhere but in my childhood home. Something that always struck me as odd was how in movies and stories a lot of the spirits/entities seem to be focused on closets and wardrobes, or at least to seem somewhat fond of them. Any ideas what this could be? When I was 7, I lived in a small apartment with my mum, her boyfriend at the time, and 2 siblings, 1 brother, 1 sister. My brother was a few years younger than me, and my sister was only a few weeks/months older. I shared a room with my brother for a while, but I kept waking up in the middle of the night, and I thought he was the one waking me up every night, so I told my mum. She moved my brother into a spare room, so now I was sleeping in this room alone. I went to bed as usual, thinking I wouldn't be disturbed in the middle of the night, so I was kind of happy. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and looking out my window. It was late at night, and there was someone outside with their dogs, so I figured the dog barked and woke me up. I rolled over to get out of bed and go to the bathroom. That's when I saw the dark outline of a man standing in my closet. He was tall, average build, and had deep, glowing red eyes. I froze. I felt like I physically couldn't move, and I remember hiding under my blanket and falling back asleep. This repeated for about a week before I refused to sleep in that room and started sleeping on the couch. My mum got into a fight with her boyfriend one night and slept in my room so she wouldn't have to deal with him. What I remember from her story is this. As she was about to fall asleep, she felt the bed shake. This couldn't have been explained by any pets, since we hadn't got any, and no one else was home. She ran out the room and was obviously shaken. A few weeks later, my aunt slept over, and as she was young at the time and had nothing to do for the weekend, she slept in my room, despite my mum warning, and the bed was dragged towards the closet. She ran into my mum's room, visibly shaken, and wouldn't leave. Looking back on this a few years ago, I thought it was just my imagination, until my mum told me the rest of the story a few months ago. My stepdad said it was a demon living in my closet. This didn't happen to me, but my mother last night at 3 a.m. My mum is really hard to scare. It takes more than a simple jump scare for her to flee a room. My mum was watching TV with us and fell asleep on the couch in her room. She woke at the middle of the night because she was freezing cold. So she grabbed her blanket and wrapped it around herself for warmth and walked to bed. Facing her closet, she began to fall asleep when she watched her closet door open slowly. A man, darker than the darkness of her room, walked out and faced her. "Suzanne," it said. He was about to say something else, but before he could, she bolted out the room. She said, that it's giving her the feeling that she knew someone was going to die. One weird thing about it was that it wasn't sleep paralysis. I know most of you won't believe me, but I'm terrified. And if you know anything that can help, please tell me. Every night, as soon as the clock hits midnight, my normally quiet and reserved cat, Bamboo, makes her way to the closet in my boyfriend and I's apartment. The building is fairly new, only being built about a year ago. We're the first people to rent this apartment unit. Even still, for the past month or so, Bamboo will walk to the door of the closet and let out a yowl. It's always this specific yowl that she makes, and I can't even describe it, and can't find any similar kitty sounds through hundreds of YouTube videos I've watched. After greeting whatever caught her interest from inside that closet, she will enter and let out another noise, which is almost the same to the first one. If you've heard cats meowing for attention, or if they are looking for their owner, but if you knew Bamboo, you would understand why this behavior is so strange. She isn't fond of attention or anything like that. I'd heard about cats being able to see into more dimensions than humans can, and I wonder if this is true, if this really is some unknown presence or thing setting up in my closet. My boyfriend and I have considered buying some ghost equipment in order to try and communicate. I live in a house that's not too old. It was handmade by the original owners, and only 2 families have resided here. Since I've been here, I've felt as if I'm never alone, always watched, and have had strange experiences. While there's no logical reason to get into them, this experience is seriously freaking me out. A few months ago, I was sorting through coins with a friend when he found 2 coins that were different. They were bent and scratched to the point where the copper was gone and revealed the zinc underneath it. Obviously, he asked me if I'd done it, and I told them that I found them while sorting through my closet. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People have weird-ass coping mechanisms and interests. We make a common joke that the supposed ghost that makes me feel followed is named Keith, and it's also a recurring joke that he lives in my closet. So we joked it was him and didn't think too much of it. Fast forward to March 28th this year. I'm currently in my room. As of a few minutes ago, the pennies were sitting on my dresser along with some jewellery. But this is no longer the case. I was watching TV and decided to light some candles, one being on the dresser. After lighting them, I noticed the pennies were gone. I've checked the carpeting under the floors, behind my dresser, and the drawer, and everywhere it's physically possible for them to be, but I can't find them. Perhaps my brain is playing a trick on me, or I subconsciously moved them somewhere else. But if anyone has any information on this freaky stuff, I'd really appreciate it. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's closet stories. We had a good mix here of real people and paranormal kind of closet stories, so I thought that was a pretty interesting combo for tonight. If you enjoyed what you heard, you know what to do, and if you would like to be credited at the end of every video like the lovely, amazing people on screen, all that you have to do is click the link to patreon.com for some cool prizes and stuff. If you do that, you get some exclusive audios.